television show on. It's been running for quite a few years. I've never seen it, but I've heard about it in the news and so forth. It's called The Apprentice, I think. And the premise of the show is you've got this super rich, or at least was a super rich, super powerful guy who is trying to determine whether a group of individuals are worthy of being an apprentice. And he puts them through various tasks, and as I understand it, most of them fail, and I don't really know how the show goes. Somehow they get voted off the island or something. But the famous phrase, of course, when the person has failed in their task of being an apprentice, is the guy, points his finger at him and says, "You're fired," or something like that. The reason I bring that up is because in some ways, there's a parallel to what we are seeing here in Matthew chapter 23 in how Jesus is interacting with the religious leaders of the day. They are, maybe apprentices is a good word, or caretakers. They were hired by God, clearly the most powerful person in the universe, clearly the richest person ever, to take care of people, to take care of His Word, to take care of His Messiah, and prepare the world for the coming of a Savior. It was an important, vital task, which they failed at miserably. They ended up becoming very self-focused and wanted to preserve their own power rather than hand power over to God. And at the same time, they really kept people from coming to an understanding of what it was like to follow the one true and holy God. And so, as Jesus approaches the crucifixion, for most of the time during His public ministry, He was very quiet about who He was. Very sort of meek, almost like, why are you shying away from talking about your mission? But during this final week of His earthly life, after He has pretty much declared Himself to be the Messiah by arriving on Palm Sunday to Jerusalem, riding on a donkey, fulfilling numerous prophecies, He's now ready to speak. He's now ready to give a judgment to those who had been hired by Him as caretakers of His people and of His Word. And Jesus' word to them is very simply, "You're fired." So He doesn't mince any words. In fact, we're going to see in Matthew chapter 23, we're going to take it in a couple of bites, just 12 verses today. They are, words of anger, really. They are words of indignation. He's not holding back at all. And His monologue is really two parts here in chapter 23. And the first one is aimed squarely at those religious leaders, those apprentices, giving them the pink slip. Part 2 is really aimed at Jerusalem and all of the Jews who had not yet decided whether He was indeed the Messiah and whether they were going to accept Him and reject Him. And it really shows the heart of God toward His people and a longing for relationship with them that echoes through the entire Old Testament. Now, the audience here in chapter 23 is interesting because Jesus is speaking these things to the crowds and His disciples, and yet clearly He's talking about the religious leaders who were hanging around on the margins listening to everything that He was saying. It's interesting because I think the message is as much for them as it is a warning to the religious leaders, them being the people and the disciples, because it's something that we need to keep in mind as we read these verses as well. You got to point out that the problem that Israel faced at that time was not a problem with the people. It was a problem with the religious leadership. The people were as much victimized as anything else. But that having been said, the attitudes that Jesus is talking about with the religious leaders, the scribes and the Pharisees, they're a lot closer to our attitudes than I think we would like to admit. And I'll go further than that. If we could, we'd probably be pretty much like these guys. Oh, you say, Pastor Tom, we would never be that way. No, of course not. I believe you. Truth of the matter is, what we need is simply motive, means,
and opportunity. We've got the motive already. Because as we'll see as we go through this, if we could set the rules of behavior so that we look better than anybody else we know, we'd do it. And in fact, we'd set that standard so that no one could rise to our level of what we consider to be perfection, as imperfect as that would really be. Secondly, innately, it's the default programming in the human nature to like to be respected and lauded even, and we do things so that that will take place. I know we like to think of ourselves in a better light, but that's just how unredeemed human nature works. So we've got the motive. The problem is we don't have the means or the opportunity to really pull it off. But the scribes and the Pharisees did. God put them in charge, a great deal of responsibility. They had the same motive, they had the means, and they had the opportunity. But you have to remember that from the opinions of the people that lived in Jesus' time, the scribes and the Pharisees were really looked up to. They were considered the most holy, the most together. If you were to say, who's the example of somebody that you ought to emulate? They'd say, oh, the scribes and the Pharisees. They were looked up to incredibly. Excuse me. They were among the most righteous people you will ever meet. They put our righteousness to shame. But here's the deal. Their righteousness was simply a coat of paint. My son and I were talking last night about lead and lead paint, lead-based paint, and how it used to be that a lot of houses were painted with lead paint, and they had all these warnings and everything as the paint would chip off and little kids would put it in their mouths and they would be eating lead, and it was all a horrible thing. And so what people did is they, instead of having to take all this lead paint off, they just painted coats of non-lead based paint over the top of it. And in some ways, that's kind of what the Pharisees did.